Hello, welcome. I hope you are having a wonderful October and I hope you are in full blast October mood because I'm about to share with you the best books that I ever read that I think are perfect for romanticizing the season and just helping you make the best out of it. So when I think about October, I either think about very dark, spooky, gothic, stormy nights type of thing, or I think about enjoying everything from the comfort and coziness of my home with the protection of walls and a window from which I can observe everything that happens on the outside. So I kind of wanted to mix both of those feelings into this video, and I compiled a list of books, or the ultimate guide if you will, that span 3 different categories that I think are perfect for really getting at all of these different feelings about October. So let's just dive right into it. The first category that I want to talk about are books that instill a sense of Gothic shadows. So these are books that blend death, darkness, decay with beauty and with elegance. You can think about lonely moors, haunted castles, dark alleys, but all of that with an underlying feeling of poetry and tragedy and lyricism. So this is really where I want your mind to go when you think about these books. The first one that I have to recommend on this list is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This is probably one of my favorite books of all time. I read it a couple times in university and I just never looked back. I was never able to shake it from that high up place in the ranking system of the best books that I'm ever reading. This story is one of the most beautifully executions of atmosphere and gothic that I've ever encountered in a book. There are so many beautiful scenes of thunderstorms, stormy nights. It's all the perfect setting for the story, which is a story about creation, a story about the consequences of creation and the consequences of meddling with nature's rules for us, for humans, consequences of scientific ego, scientific malpractice, a story about the loneliness and the actual depravity of scientific ambition, where that can lead you if you don't have some sort of balance of humility and actual benevolence when you go into these disciplines. So that's part of it. And the other part of the story is the story about loneliness, a story of what it means to be different, what it means to not be accepted, a story of wanting to belong, but not being able to because you're different or you look different. When you read this book, if you've never read it before, I want you to keep in mind the question of what it means to be a monster and who is the actual monster in the story. I find that this is such a wonderfully executed work, and I'm a little bit sad that in contemporary media it's been really watered down to a very weird version of Frankenstein. Like, I feel like whenever we see, an animated show about Frankenstein or a picture or whatever in contemporary media, it's most of the time this green monster that walks around as like brains or something. And that's so far from the actual atmosphere and vibe of the actual book. And that's actually one of the reasons why I never wanted to read this book, because I was seeing those images and I was like, that's not interesting to me, it doesn't appeal to me. And then I read the book and it just felt like a completely different world. So if you're one of those people who also don't really feel like they have a connection with how media portrays Frankenstein, maybe read the book because it's going to be a completely different experience. All right, let's continue with the classics. And the next classic that I have to talk about is Dracula by Bram Stoker. So this is a story of a young solicitor who works in England, and he is responsible for making a business deal with a very mysterious old businessman from Transylvania. So this businessman is bringing in lots of money. So because of that, he will actually have to travel all the way to Transylvania to ensure that the paperwork is correctly done. When he gets there, there is this sense of dread and fear in the villagers next to the town in which that businessman lives. He lives in a secluded castle quite far along from, the rest of civilization. But when he gets to the village next to that castle, he meets all sorts of people who seem to be very afraid for him. And then he gets to the castle and things just become quite crazy. I absolutely adore the first portion of this book. Like the first section of the book, I would characterize it as the psychological representation of evil. It gets into manipulation in particular, and I think that just is absolutely brilliantly done in this book, where you could see how evil uses manipulation not only to justify their deeds, but it also uses it as a tool to gaslight their victims and to making those victims feel as though they have agency, as though they have a decision to make in everything that is happening to them, when in reality we all know that's not the case. And I think this was absolutely masterfully done in this book. The second part of the book is a bit more plot forward. We move locations, we move back to England from Transylvania, and we are following different people, all in one way or another engaged in this big mystery. I read some reviews of some people saying that they think it's offensive how Bram Stoker wrote about Romanian people back in the day, because he's not Romanian. I am Romanian, and I can tell you, I think he did an incredibly well done job. Romanian people are very, very religious, and back in the day, they were even more so. And so, Bram Stoker represents these villagers that were living in Transylvania as very religious, kind of very superstitious people. And I can absolutely tell you that although that's a stereotype, it's a stereotype that is based on real characteristics of Romanians. I feel that maybe today, in this day and age, it's not as prevalent, but you can still see it a lot, especially in smaller villages. So I don't think that's too far fetched from the truth, and it's actually a very creative way to instill the setting of the story in Romania. So I think that's great, and I don't see anything offensive about that. And in fact, if you like the story and you like the spooky castle in it, you can go visit the Bran Castle in Romania that is still standing, and it's still visited by multiple visitors every year. It is a little bit of a tourist scheme, because the castle itself is supposed to be the representation of the mansion of Vlad the Impaler, who was the historical reference for writing Dracula. But in fact, Vlad the Impaler actually just lived in that mansion for a couple months, like 3 or 4 months. So it wasn't his permanent location. His permanent castle is destroyed, if I'm not mistaken. It's not actually where he lived, but he did live there for 3 months. So, maybe his soul and spirit is still in the castle. But it is a beautiful location to visit. I've been there. I really enjoyed it, and I want to go back actually. So yeah, if you're interested in the more architectural Gothic elements from this book, you can actually visit them in real life. So just to continue with the story of Dracula, the next book that I want to talk about is one of my favorite books of last year, and that is The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. First of all, the book is huge. It's about 1,000 pages, I think. It's one of the longest works I've ever read. You know a book is good when it's so goddamn long, and not a single time do you get bored of reading. There were so many moments where I was reading and I was like, how am I not bored yet? This is so long. It takes forever to get through. How am I not bored? Every single time I would pick it up, I would get absolutely transported into the location where we're at. There are multiple timelines in this book. There are multiple storylines in this book that all kind of coincide together. The story follows a father telling his young daughter the mysterious story of how he met her mother, and also a mysterious story about him when he was a grad student. So essentially, when he was a grad student as a historian, his supervisor disappeared one stormy mysterious night, and he disappeared in a very weird way that coincided with the appearance of a ancient mysterious text. So this grad student embarks in a journey of trying to find out what happened to his supervisor because he is so sure that it has something to do with that weird text that he found. This story is truly a love letter to the history and the culture of Europe. It goes from so many different locations in Europe. It goes through Budapest, it goes to Transylvania, it goes to Istanbul. I think at some point we're in Prague, in Paris. It truly feels like a love letter to all the history and the culture of the continent. It's incredibly immersive, and obviously, at some point in time, we get to meet Dracula himself, as it's a reimagining or retelling of his story, a little bit more in contemporary terms. From all of the books on this list, I would definitely say this is the most immersive one, the most atmospheric one. Every word that was written just transported me directly into the story and made the beautiful fall foliage and the beautiful dark stormy nights just come right to life in front of me. It was an incredible experience. I read part of it and I also listened to the audiobook for the other part of it, and both reading and the audiobook experiences were 10 out of freaking 10. I could not recommend this book more. All right, we are continuing with another classic, and that is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This one follows Dorian Gray, who is a young, very handsome man who gets his portrait painted at the beginning of the story. He also meets a young aristocrat, and he kind of starts to fall in love with his lifestyle of pure hedonism, just essentially following everything beautiful, everything pleasurable, and not really thinking of consequences, not really thinking of anything long term, and just focusing on short term gratification. And because he starts to embark on this lifestyle of hedonism, Dorian becomes more and more upset with the fact that he will actually, end up growing old and he will not always be so beautiful and so handsome. And so it's a bit the theme of making a deal with the devil type thing where his wish is granted to him, and instead of getting old he can just continue to be young forever, and the painting that was painted of him at the beginning of the story takes on the decaying and dying of him, and it's really a representation of how this painting is taking on the decay of his soul because of the decisions that he's making about how to live his life. Just like all of the other books on this list, this is incredibly beautifully written. You have all of the Gothic elements in here. You have the spooky attic in which the painting is stored forever because Dorian is very concerned with other people finding the painting of him. There's tragedy in here. There's dark nights going to the opera. It's really a creative story and a beautiful story with a moral to it. Okay, let's go back to the vampires. I have another story that this one is not a classic, it's more a contemporary, and that is The Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. I know that a lot of people recently have read and loved this book, and I'm here to tell you once again, read it. This follows the bride of Dracula. So in the original story by Bram Stoker, we know that Dracula has brides. We are aware of that fact and we get to see them a little bit, but not very often in the story. This book is essentially giving them a voice, giving them their own space to exist and to tell their story. It's written very sensually, very intimately. The main perspective is the perspective of Constanta, which I actually have a real problem with. I think the author was trying to be historically accurate and get a Romanian name to represent the main character of the story, which is very similar to a Romanian name, but it's actually a bit inaccurate. So the Romanian name is Constanța with S, whereas this book, the way it's written at least, is Constanta. So it's very difficult for me to say Constanta because I feel like that doesn't exist in Romania. Yeah, I'll say Constanța from now on. I'm sorry. It's what makes sense to me. So we follow the perspective of Constanza, who is the first bride of Dracula. The story really follows decades of them, going from location to location and existing as vampires in Europe. It's very similar to The Historian in the sense of we're going from different locations in Europe, and I feel that it's a very beautiful, again, just mix of the culture and the history, and just imbuing all of that in this beautiful story is something that just brings the atmosphere to life. But at its core, the story here, it's more a story of connection, relationships, and toxicity in that. I think it's a very smart way to talk about something that is, very common in today's day and age, to discuss any sort of assault or to discuss toxicity in relationships. So I think it's a really smart way to take such an ancient story and talk about problems that we have in contemporary times. It's a very short read, it keeps you on your toes. You get introduced to multiple characters, and just the fine line between seduction and love and devotion, but also control and toxic representation of what love is. Okay, the next book is technically starting in November, so I think this could be a good kind of end of October slash beginning of November transition, and that is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. This book, the way that it starts is absolutely gorgeous. We are set in a storm on some dark, secluded moors in England, I believe. Just that atmosphere of how the story starts sets a tone for an incredibly toxic, dark, tragic story. It follows mainly a love story between Catherine and Heathcliff, but it's a love story that is very toxic, very vengeful, very obsessive. I have never in my life read such a clear and accurate representation of what it means to be obsessed, like crazy obsessed with another person. This book quite literally is the OG of toxic love. All the negative emotions that you can think about in that type of relationship, like jealousy, pride, cruelty, it's all in here. The setting of the story, I would say, also adds a lot to this feeling and the atmosphere of the book. I mean, it's set in a secluded mansion on quiet moors where you get so many descriptions of storms and how storms are impeding people from accessing that specific location or going away from that location. And if you're in the mood for a little bit more drama than any of these other stories, this is the one that you want to go for. Okay, the next book that I want to recommend is a book that I would consider a little bit of a blend between the gothic and the cozy, and that is Anatomy of Love Story by Dana Schwartz. This is part of a duology. I've read both of these books, and I would say the second one, it's even more gothic-y and amazing. So if you like the first, please go ahead and read the second because it's just as good, if not better. This follows the story of Hazel, who knows from a very young age that she wants to become a surgeon. That is her gift, that is her wish in life, but she is born in the wrong era for that. She's born in 19th century in Edinburgh. Unfortunately, back then, women did not have access to go to university and to study for such jobs. So Hazel has to become a bit creative with the ways in which she's able to study to pass the final examination to become a surgeon, because she's technically not allowed to attend classes and lectures. So whereas all of her colleagues are able to, practice on cadavers that are brought to the university, she has to find her own. So she gets entangled with a grave robber, and I mean, that's as much as you need to know. There's scenes of robbing graves in the middle of the night, candlelit labs, spying on people on dark alleys at the university. The tone in this is just as good as any other book in here, but it's a bit more toned down. I think this is probably YA. Oh yeah, it's YA. So, it's a bit less actual gothic, but it does have a lot of gothic elements, and it just gets a little bit closer to a cozy read. If you're into that, then please pick it up. It's a really, really good read. Okay, so I've been debating whether I should recommend this next book, and I've come to the conclusion that I will. The reason why I wasn't sure is because it's a book that is not a novel, and it's a book that has been written a while ago. It's a very ancient work. It's an epic. If you've never read an epic before, epics are essentially long, long poems about usually a hero that have a very popular tradition back from the days of Homer. So you can think about ancient Greece, or some Latin writers as well have participated in this tradition. And the one that I'm talking about is Dante's Inferno. Dante's Inferno is essentially a work that is written in verse and is the first part in the three-part book of the Divine Comedy. It might be a bit weird to read if you're not used to this type of writing, but I think it's so worth it. I think it's a writing that is still so accessible, even though it's written in that format. It starts with Dante being, the writer, but also the main character in this story. And he wakes up in the middle of the night in a forest. He feels lost. And it's obviously a metaphor for him being lost in life a bit, being lost and looking for a journey towards something in his life. And we follow Dante going through hell. This was really a big deal when it was written because it was one of the first imaginations and representations of what hell could look like. So it's very architectural in that way because it literally explains all of the levels of hell. There are 9 levels of hell, and we go through every single one of them, and they're kind of mirroring the sins of people on earth. So we have a level for gluttony, we have a level for lust. You can definitely take this book into a more serious study, absolutely, and you should if you're interested in that. But I think this is one of those ancient works that could still be read just as a form of escapism, which is honestly mind-boggling. I cannot think of a lot of works that have that quality of being able to be read just as escapist works. But still have so much content to study and to appreciate from a literary standpoint. So this is the type of book that you can do both of those things with. So that's why I think it's so amazing. Okay, let's wrap up this category with one last book. This is a contemporary book. Oh, did I wake you up? I'm doing his midday nap. So the next book that I want to talk about is a book that is a very recent release. I believe it was released this year in September, and that is The Bewitching by Silvia Moreno Garcia. So I've read from this author the Mexican Gothic before, and I have to say it was not my favorite, but this one I loved. So this follows a graduate student, a PhD student, who is enamored with this work from a specific author about the disappearance of a young girl on campus. However, there's not a lot of accessibility to this work. She's not able to access it. She's not able to access information about the author. So we essentially follow her little journey in trying to figure out what happened back then and what led this author to write this work. So that is the main timeline that we're following, but we are also following a different timeline where we are focusing on the perspective of this young girl's grandma, who is dealing with the disappearance of her brother, and she's kind of in this weird state where she is really scared about her brother not being there, but her mom and her uncle are acting really weird about it. They're acting very nonchalant about it. And then the third timeline that we're following is the timeline of the actual author who wrote that story that I mentioned at the beginning, and essentially what happened back then. I think from this category is the only one that focuses more on witches as opposed to vampires or monsters. So if you're in for a witchy story, I think this is the perfect read for you. It also has a lot of dark academia, so we're going from location to location, looking at old manuscripts, trying to uncover what happened in this story. And it has a beautiful description of Latin American legend of witchcraftry, and how that imbues into the story is, I think, really wonderfully done. All right, so we've made it through the first category. Now let's go into something a little bit more cozy, but still with a dash of magic. The first book that I will recommend is, again, one of my favorite books of all time. And it's really more than a book, it's a whole series, but start with the first. And I'm talking about, obviously, Harry Potter. This series is my go-to comfort read series. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it because I feel like, what's the point? Everyone knows the story of Harry Potter. Everyone has probably watched the movies. But if you have not read the books yet, let me tell you, you need to read the books. They are the most cozy truly atmospheric, comforting stories I've ever read in my whole entire life. Usually, when I start a series, I space out the books that I read in that series. So, like, I'll read one book one year, I'll wait another year, I'll read the second book the following year. But with this one, I read most of them back to back. I just could not stop reading. My favorite parts of these books are really just the slice of life descriptions of Harry and his friends going to their classes, going to library after classes, trying to uncover little mysteries, and then following them along in celebrations of Halloween or celebrations of Christmas, which are so beautifully described here. Oh my god, I really want to do a reread, but I shouldn't. I've had the best time. There's such comforting reads, and the description of friendship in these books, honestly, is probably the best description of friendship I've ever came across in any books. It just shows the complexities of what it means to have a friend, what it means to root for someone, but also sometimes having the confounding feelings of jealousy or dealing with feelings of mistrust and how you have to combat those and essentially find the trust in your friend. Just please read the books. It's going to take you on the most marvelous journey for your October. Okay, the next one in this category is also, I think it would be considered a middle grade as well, and that's The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. I have tried a couple books from Neil Gaiman. They weren't always a hit, but this one really hit. So the book starts a bit gruesomely. We're following Bod, who is escaping essentially the tragic murder of his entire family. He's the only survivor of this tragic event, and what he does is that he runs into a graveyard to basically escape and try to survive. In the graveyard, he meets ghosts that are taking over and taking care of him from then on. I mean, the whole entire book, or most of it, is set in a graveyard at night. So I think that tells you everything you need to know about the autumnal content of the story. But at the heart of it, although, it starts a bit tragically, it's just a story about found family. It's beautifully written and really not a crazy time commitment. It's pretty short as opposed to the other books on this list. Okay, the next one, I'm trying to remember the whole title because it's huge. The Southern Book Club Guide to Slaying Vampires, I think that's it, by Grady Hendrix. This book was such a pleasant surprise to me when I read it. I did not expect to love it as much as I did. It follows a very vintage atmosphere of 1990s suburban South Carolina in a small community of housewives. Essentially, these housewives don't have a lot going on aside from their domestic duties, and they meet every week or every 2 weeks to have a book club. And during this book club, they discuss books that are interested in, but they also obviously gossip. And one of the housewives in this book club, Patricia, notices the appearance of a new person in town called James. He's very handsome, he's very charismatic, but she finds it a bit weird that his appearance coincides with disappearances of young kids in the surrounding area. And so she kind of embarks with her girlfriends on this adventure of trying to figure out what is happening with these kids. It does sound very cozy, and it is a very cozy story, but it does have some more gruesome scenes in it. So be advised of that. But aside from that, I just love the feminist undertones in this book. It also discusses issues like stereotyping and racism, and I really like how the author kind of wove those themes into the story without making them take the forefront, but also without taking away importance from those themes. So it's really just a comforting read about the power of community and the power of getting together to solve a mystery and to protect your family and your community together. Okay, I have one more story in this category, and it's also a duology actually. So if you want to read the second book, you can. But the first book in that duology is In the Company of Witches by Orly Wallace. This is essentially a murder mystery. I do not like murder mysteries. I've read quite a bit of them, and they just never hit the spot for me. There's something so boring to me about trying to find out who murdered who. But this one was done really well. First of all, let's just take a moment for the beautiful cover of this book. I mean, it's everything. I think it's so beautifully done and so different from the typical covers that are kind of popularized nowadays. This follows the story of Bryn, who is a young witch. She's about 30, at the beginning of her 30s, and she lives with two of her aunts in a B&B that she runs, or they run together. They live in a small, cozy Gilmore Girl type of town where everyone is in everyone's business, And at the beginning of the story, a kind of weird woman that is living in that town gets murdered in their Airbnb. And the town starts to assume that one of Bryn's aunts is actually the murderer. And so Bryn has to go on this little investigation to try to find out what happened, because she doesn't believe that her aunt could actually do that. Bryn is also a witch, but her powers are not really working that well anymore since the death of her husband a couple of years back, and she's lost the ability to really surge those powers and make them come to life. So I just really love the murder mystery cozy aspect of it that was really well blended with the more personal development of Bryn herself, trying to come to terms with the mourning of her husband and find her powers again, and more metaphorically speaking, find her way back to herself and back to her life without her husband. I have one more category for you, and this one is called Unsettling Tales. These are tales that are a bit more psychological. They do have horror elements, some of them, but it's not horror in the sense of gothic and atmospheric. A sense of horror where we're really getting at human violence is a bit more unsettling and just definitely more terrorizing than a gothic, spooky atmosphere. The first book that I have to recommend is a book that I honestly read in 2 sittings because I just could not put it down. It's a psychological thriller that is focused on a family drama. It's Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. This follows the story of Lydia, who is a teenager that has been found drowned. We don't know exactly what happened to her, and so the story is us essentially going on a historical quest and expedition to try to find out what happened to Lydia in the leading months before her death. We follow the dynamics that she had with her parents. We also follow the dynamics that her parents had between themselves. We follow the connection that she had with her siblings as well as some of her friends. So we really delve deep into family connection and just human connection in general. This book beautifully shows how misunderstandings between people and interpretation of a person's actions or a person's words could really emotionally impact someone else in a very significant way that someone else might think is silly. And at the core of it is really just a story about social alienation and grief. The next book that I have to recommend for unsettling category is The Metamorphosis by Kafka. This, from this whole entire list, is hands down the weirdest freaking book I've ever read. We follow the story of Gregor, who wakes up one morning and he is a bug. He's been transformed into a bug. The horror of the story is not really his transformation, but rather the very weird and specific reactions of his family to his transformation. Instead of his family being concerned about him and what happened to him, they become concerned about the economical standpoint of the family as a result of what happened. They become concerned about their social lives and what this means for them to exist in society as a family, how others might portray their family differently because of what happened to Gregor. It's definitely an absurd book, but at the core of that absurdity is just a sense of suffocating loneliness, where the connections that we have with other people are superficial and they're not rooted in any sense of authenticity. And when you bring that to the extreme, what it actually looks like. The next book that I'm going to recommend is a book that I read this summer. I was not a full fan of it, but I think the reason why I didn't enjoy it as much is just because I'm not a fan of horror, but I definitely appreciated the beautiful way in which the story was written and the literary genius behind the story, and I'm talking about Carrie by Stephen King. So this story follows Carrie, a young teenager who is dealing with her fair and share of bad shit happening to her. She is heavily bullied in school, and aside from her being bullied in school, her family situation is not better either. She is dealing with a mom who is extremely religious, but not just normal type of religious, she's cultish level religious. So she won't allow Carrie to wear normal clothes. She won't allow Carrie to hang out with people her age. She essentially traps Carrie into the house most of the time. Carrie also has telekinetic powers, so she's able to move stuff around with her mind. And the story is really a very foreshadowed thriller where the more the story goes on, the suspense keeps on getting higher, and you get to the end and it's like a big boom. I think it's a very sad story, just showing the reality of what it means to be a teenager in such a cruel world, and it shows the huge implications of repressed cult trauma and repressed sexuality in particular. My goodness, the sun is going crazy right now. It was supposed to be like a gloomy, Octobery filming situation, but I guess the sun has decided to enter the chat, so it is what it is. We're going with it. So, the next book that I want to talk about is Into the Drowning Deep by Myra Grant. This book I read also last year, and it was also one of my favorite reads of last year. It was really, 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 really good. It's a setting that is very outside of my comfort zone because we are following a ship crew going outside into the ocean on the quest to find mermaids. The same trip has been done about 10 years prior to the events of our story, and that crew disappeared completely. We have a couple of video footages from that trip, but they're kind of unclear. We're not sure exactly what happened to them, and so on the anniversary of their disappearance, a new crew goes back to try to find out what happened back then. The main perspective is that of Tori, who is a marine biologist and is the sister of one of the girls who disappeared with the first crew that went along. What I really liked about the story is actually the wide cast of characters. All of the characters in this book are so unique, and they are so unique not only in their individual characteristics but also in the way that they contribute to the story because of their professional contributions. So we have marine biologists, we have the video camera crew, we have historical scholars on the subject of mermaids, and it just made it for such an interesting new perspective that I haven't really found in other books. It's not really a book that I would consider cozy at all. It did have some dark academia elements just because of those professors that were on the cruise ship, but more than anything, it felt a bit claustrophobic because you are stuck on a ship and there's this sense of doom throughout the whole entirety of the story where you know something's going to happen, but you're not sure what yet. There's also quite a bit of description about the scientific gear. So we have sonar readings, ecological data that is described, evolutionary speculation based on what the scholars were writing about mermaids. So it's all just coming together in this grand scientific adventure. And I really, really enjoyed that. I think it was incredibly well done. It's also very mysterious and thrilling. So it also has those plotting elements that continue to make you really intrigued in the story. Okay, this video is probably getting very long, so I have one more book to share with you, which I don't think is going to be a surprise for anyone. A lot of people talk about this book because it's really goddamn good, and that is The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. Here we follow the story of a famous painter who shoots her husband and then she stops talking. So because she stops talking, she is not able to really tell her side of the story about what happened, and she is brought into a psychiatric asylum. For many, many years, she has not said a word. Nobody can talk to her, nobody can get information from her until we have a new psychiatric doctor that comes along who is trying to set a connection with her and try to find out what happened. The best part of the story is really the plotting of it. I mean, it's just masterful the way that the author thought about all the twists and turns of the story. I felt like every single time I thought I knew what was going to happen, I didn't. I was completely wrong and I did not see the end coming. Everyone talks about the end, everyone says the ending is grand. And so I went into it being like, oh, I'll figure it out. I'll figure it out. And then I obviously did not figure it out. So the ending was really well done and it really took me by surprise. I really, really enjoyed the story just for the thrilling suspense element of it. I hope you found something in this video. I hope you got at least one book that intrigued you and that you think could be a good addition to your TBR this month. All of these books have been really amazing for me personally and have, added good value to me romanticizing autumn. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any other recommendations, please leave them down below in the comments and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.